Well, welcome everybody to Arise Above OT. We wanted to have Dr. Tony here with us today to talk about the gut-brain connection, which Meghan and I kind of incorporate already into a lot of our sessions with you guys. So everybody except one person is here because of a concussion. I don't know your history, but maybe you have had one in the past. Diagnosed or undiagnosed. This is true. So first question, how many people actually had breakfast today? Coffee doesn't count. Coffee alone doesn't count. So yikes, a lot of people haven't even eaten yet today. So that is step number one. We have to get that metabolism going and that energy going and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a good thing that we brought him here today. He can definitely tell you why. I'm sure he will talk about that part. So others are here then to learn just how the gut and the brain work together, because there's a huge connection there. So I'll give a brief little educational piece on what happens during a concussion and why it's important to incorporate the gut and brain with that. So a concussion, as we know, is a jolt, blow, or force to the head or neck, which causes an axon shearing. So the axon is the nerve cell, and what it does is it transmits information from one cell to another so that our bodies work in sequential order. So when we get a concussion, what happens is there's a sharing of those axons, either from the brain on the skull. Think of the skull in your head as like a upside down bowl full of jello. So we've got the bowl on the top, which is our skull, and then we've got the jello inside, which is our brain. So it's a little squishy, and so if you shake a bowl of jello, you can see that it wiggles. So the same thing happens during a concussion to our brain. So there's gray and white matter, and they're two different densities. And so what happens, if it's a rotational component, if it's a forward-backwards component, that sharing of even the brain amongst itself can cause those axons to either stretch, to break, just to get compressed, and then they're not working as well as they should be. So that in and of itself, when that concussion or that incident happens, will cause immediate changes in the body. So there's an immediate cascade of events, and this in turn causes an energy crisis within our body. That energy crisis then wreaks havoc with all of the chemicals, the neurotransmitters within our body, and those signals that go from the brain to the gut are immediately affected. So evidence has now shown that within up to as soon as 3 hours, there are changes that occur after trauma to the brain in the gut lining, in the mucosa, in the villi that are in the intestines and all of that stuff. So there's actually changes that are happening within the gut up to as soon as 3 hours after that initial trauma. Stress then can also cause changes in the gut microbiome and that gut barrier function. So that can lead to things like leaky gut, which I'm sure Dr. Tony is going to talk about, and just other GI issues that will then release toxins into our body, and that's also going to cause us not to be healthy and working at our optimal performance. Lastly, just childhood trauma can lead to a pro-inflammatory state and low cortisol levels. So anyone with a childhood concussion, that can again lead to that inflammation in the body. When that happens, when there's low cortisol levels, you may have fatigue, dizziness, especially when you go to stand up, weight loss, muscle weakness, mood changes, which are all also kind of interesting enough, things that can happen after we've had a concussion. But the good news is that we know that we can heal your gut, and that's exactly why we asked Dr. Tony to come with us today, because diet can be so helpful in helping us recover and to help us improve that brain fog, that fatigue, and some sleep issues and all of that kind of stuff. As OTs, Meghan and I have talked to most of you about the vagus nerve and interoception, and that is also related to that gut-brain connection. So dysautonomia can happen after that concussion or that trauma, and so that is when our flight system is in conflict with our rest and digest system. And so that vagus nerve is what is in charge of that rest and digest system. So this is our friend, the vagus nerve here. It's the longest cranial nerve in our body, and it attaches right out of the brainstem. So it's cranial nerve 10, and it's nicknamed the Wanderer because it's so long, and you can see that it goes all the way from the back of our brain all the way down into our gut, and then sends information constantly back and forth between those two areas in our body. And so if the vagus nerve is impaired, either from trauma or just because of the chemicals not interacting as they should, what can happen is we can get headaches, we can get anxiety, we can have cognitive changes, we can have mood changes, we can have sleep changes. So again, most of you are seeing us for vision, and so we already know that your cranial nerve is impacted. 3 or 4 of them actually, which control our eyeballs in some way, shape, or form, are already impacted because of that event from a concussion. So it's likely that something's also going on with that vagus nerve, which is also coming out of that same part of our brain that's in the back of our head. So the vagus nerve's job is to constantly communicate motor and sensory information back and forth. So it'll tell the gallbladder to secrete bile, the pancreas to secrete insulin. It releases neuroepinephrine, which is a neurotransmitter, fancy word for a chemical that's in our body, that helps to strengthen memories and that sort of thing. So if we're not releasing enough of that chemical, think of it kind of like as Pac-Man, our brain and our experiences are not allowed to encode what we're experiencing so that we can put it either in our long-term memory section of our brain or in our short-term memory section of our brain. It releases acetylcholine to help with monitor our breathing and our heart rate. So we don't want to be in that fight or flight kind of shallow breathing kind of, place that we get when we're anxious, but it also wants to keep our heart rate nice and slow and paced so that we're not feeling that constant thumping of our heart and that sort of thing. So that is all the vagus nerve. It's also in charge of the inflammatory reflex. So again, think of any injury that we have. We're always in that inflamed state, right? You twist your ankle, you hurt your shoulder, there's inflammation and swelling that goes there. Your brain is the same way, so there's inflammation in the brain. Also goes along with any autoimmune disorders, so especially if you have comorbidities where you might have rheumatoid arthritis or you might have lupus or fibromyalgia, all of those autoimmune kind of things that you're already putting your body into an inflamed state. A concussion on top of that is going to really wreak havoc and keep you in that inflammatory reflex. So that is also controlled by the vagus nerve, again, because it releases that acetylcholine and the neuroepinephrine. The vagus nerve also releases oxytocin and vasopressin and prolactin. So these are all fancy words, but basically know that it releases a chemical that helps to combat the cortisol. So I mentioned before that when cortisol is too low, you can have symptoms, but also when cortisol is too high, you can also have symptoms because that is our stress hormone. So the cortisol levels are just too high, and then that's also going to wreak havoc with our system. And so most importantly, like I've already mentioned, the vagus nerve is the huge connection between that gut and brain connection. If there's something wrong, again, with the vagus nerve, there might be issues that you have noticed that either your speaking voice is a little bit crackly, you might have swallowing issues, or you're constantly clearing your throat, those kinds of things, or you might be choking on things that you normally wouldn't have been choking on. You might notice that you're having ear loss, hearing loss, or ear pain. That can happen. There's 3 branches of the vagus nerve that go into our earlobe, so a lot of times, sometimes just to activate that vagus nerve, we can do some techniques there to kind of settle ourselves. You might also all of a sudden have more high blood pressure issues. A lot of times we see people after concussion, after the trauma, and they were controlled with their blood pressure meds, but all of a sudden now they're really, their cardiologist is like, I don't know, yeah, I have to up your dose because they're constantly in that fight or flight piece. Vagus nerve will have decreased stomach acid and food digestion issues, so that will lead into that leaky gut kind of thing, irritable bowel, chronic fatigue, and sleep issues like I've mentioned before. So our gut, as we know, is also key to our emotions. So serotonin is another important neurotransmitter that's made in the gut, and it's critical for central nervous system, which is our brain and our spine, development and function. Does anybody know where it might be made, serotonin, in our bodies? What do you guys think? In the gut. There you go. But what part? What part? Does anybody know, what part? Because our gut is a lot of pieces and parts. You got it, yeah. So, is that correct? Yeah. Yeah, so 95% of our body's serotonin is produced in the intestine. So serotonin plays several roles in our body, including influencing learning, memory, happiness, as well as regulating body temperature, sleep, sexual behavior, and hunger, and all of those fun things. So lack of enough serotonin is also thought then to play a role in our emotions, where we may be more depressed, more anxiety. On the opposite end, we may be experiencing more mania, and then a variety of other health kind of conditions. So So when we talk about emotions, we have to talk about the interoceptive piece, and that's where Meghan can kind of take over here and kind of continue our talk. So has anybody heard of the term interoception? I know some of us have here, yeah, okay, maybe. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview. So interoception is one of our 8 internal senses. So we have like sight, smell, touch, taste, hearing. Then 3 internal ones are proprioception, so that's knowing where your body is in space. Then we have vestibular, which is your balance, and then interoception. So interoception is essentially internally knowing how your body feels. So it's the internal clues that our body signals are giving us that kind of let us connect that like to an emotion as to how we're feeling. So for example, I typically talk about it in terms of if we're stressed, how do we know we're stressed? Well, it looks different for everybody, but for me, I've been doing this for a while, right? So I'm like very in tune to what stress feels like, and I know for me it's like a tight fist, I know my heart rate gets faster, I know my voice tends to get like a little bit deeper and I'm like more short, right? So I feel that coming on, I feel the buildup of my stress and I know what that feels like for me. But it's different than for every emotion, so happiness, being excited. I also talk about it in terms of, which we'll get to in terms of the gut. How do you know the difference between a feeling in your stomach? So how do we know if we're sick? How do we know if we're hungry? How do we know if we're full, if we're cramping? Whatever it might be, how can we differentiate what that feeling is? It's interoception that allows us to say, well, this feeling must mean that I'm hungry, or this feeling must mean that I'm full, etc. So the same thing then happens too if you're sick, but again, it looks different for everybody. So some people's illness in terms of headaches might look different, right? So with concussion, we get different types of headaches, but we always talk about how I know when I have a concussion headache, I know this is related to my concussion, or I know this is just because I'm stressed. Like you can feel different types of headaches coming on, and that's just because I'm listening to my body signals and I know what type of headache I'm kind of getting and what that might be related to. So interpreting these body signals essentially allow us to then interpret an emotion, and this action then that we take to achieve homeostasis, which is the goal, is aimed at kind of addressing that emotion to do something about it. So we're kind of hitting equilibrium. So I know, again, when I'm stressed, something I have to do is run. I hate to run, but I know when I'm stressed, that is the only thing that changes the way my body feels. I have to go out, I have to run, I have to do something physical. Other people react to stress differently, right? So some people tend to kind of like shelter in and need to be quiet and go into a room where it's really quiet. Everybody reacts differently because everybody's bodies are very different. But we use it on a regular basis, so we don't kind of think about that and we take it for granted, but everybody's using interoception and interoceptive awareness on the daily basis. In terms of then concussion or any other types of conditions, there's a lot of difficulties that people can have with this interoceptive awareness. So it's linked to conditions, concussion, any type of trauma, it's linked to IBS, it's linked to obesity, it's linked to fibromyalgia. I mean, anything you can really name. Poor interoceptive awareness is linked to it, right? So anytime you experience any type of trauma or condition, our interoceptive awareness kind of decreases. And this is because we are in fight or flight, like Alicia was kind of just talking about with that rest, digest, fight or flight vagus nerve, right? So your vagus nerve becomes damaged when you experience a concussion or any other type of traumatic event or any other condition. So your body's just like in survival mode. You're just trying to survive, just trying to get through the day. You're not worried about listening to like, oh, my fists might be getting tighter, might mean I'm getting like irritated. You completely forget about that, right? You're trying to survive, and that's really it. So the interesting thing is we see it on our end a lot of times with eating, and that's kind of how I'm connecting it here in terms of the brain-gut connection. And again, it's important to note that it looks very different for everybody because everybody's hunger, for example, looks very different. I have a friend, and he's my age, he's on the spectrum, and I said to him when we were eating yesterday, I said, he kept rubbing his tummy, and I said, like, Kevin, how do you know you're full? Are you full? Like, how do you know that? He's like, I don't know. I'm like, well, what body signals do you feel? And he's telling me, he's like, well, my tongue won't stop moving, so I must be full, right? So do you equate like tongue movement to being full? No, but to him, that's like what his experience was. So it's very different for everybody, which is why too, interoception is such a kind of broad, unique topic. And I did forget to mention earlier that there's a part in the brain called the insula, and that is where our interoceptive awareness kind of works in the brain. So when we're experiencing a concussion or any other type of trauma, that chemical imbalance is obviously impacting that part of the brain as well. So then back to in terms of eating, if you're not recognizing if you're full, you're hungry, you're sick, you're not doing what you need to be doing to achieve homeostasis, your body's not reacting in a way to being aimed at, that calm state, that homeostasis. So This can look like people forgetting to eat, like, oh, I just didn't eat this morning and I didn't think anything of it. So everybody who didn't eat this morning, did you think anything of it? Or did you just kind of like go throughout the day and like, I'll eat later? Or did you notice that you didn't eat? What do you think?
Was it purposeful?
Oh, that too.
Yeah.
There's that, yeah. Which there's a lot of research then too behind, which I don't know if Dr. Tony will get to, but not listening to your body signals, like, and there's going to be certain times where you do need to ignore it, right? Like if you feel like you need to cry, but you're in a public place, like you don't need to listen to that body signal right then and there. You try to do something about it, right, and move. So there's times where, we have to adjust, but in general, the research is kind of showing with interoception, if our body's giving us that signal that maybe we're hungry, even though like, hey, I'm on a diet and I really shouldn't be eating breakfast because, it's fasting or whatever, you should still be listening to it, whether it's a small scale or a big scale, still be listening to your body, because every time you don't listen to how your body's feeling and you don't address it, you're teaching your body to suppress that interoceptive awareness and just constantly like forget, my body doesn't matter, I don't need to listen to how I'm feeling. So that's why that's super important, but then we also get people eating too much, like that's another issue that we kind of see, like you're overeating because you never get that full sensation. So you are just eating, whether it be healthy things or not, you could be overeating. And then on a bigger scale, if you don't have that interoceptive awareness, you're not able to recognize how certain foods make your body feel, right? So I know, for example, if I have my protein shake like I did in the morning with like super green foods and protein and flaxseed, I know when I drink that, like my body feels good. And you guys ever experience, like when you eat something healthy, like you feel good, right? Like it's okay, yeah, I felt good, my body feels good. You can kind of recognize those body signals. But then there's other times, like I'm such a sucker for some reason for Domino's pizza, and I can down a whole Domino's pizza, and I still love it and I eat it, but then you just feel like crap afterwards, right? So you like listen to your body and you're like, oh, yeah, I should not have done that. That was a terrible decision. But you listen to how your body feels, and that's kind of on a large scale why interoception is so important, because you need to listen to your body and what you're putting into your body and then how your body's reacting to that. And then just here we work on that a lot, I feel like, in improving that interoceptive awareness, so that not only for hunger and for the digestive system and the gut, but also for a plethora of other kind of conditions and emotions and things like that. So that's why interoception is really important in terms of the brain and gut.
Does anybody have any questions on the OT piece? I think most of you have heard our little spiels before, but we just kind of wanted to do a little rundown on that again. So on that note, let us introduce Dr. Tony Blasco. He's a chiropractor by trade, but also a functional medicine doctor, and someone who can show us how to heal our gut and brain connection. Dr. Tony.
Thank you. I'm going to try. It's kind of a complicated subject. So first of all, Alicia, Megan, thank you for having me here. Thank you guys for coming out on this beautiful spring day and braving the weather. So, when I do these talks on different subject matters, there's one thing I always know for sure that's going to happen, is that someone in this room is going to pick up one tidbit, one piece of information that's going to change your life. And that's why I love doing these talks. So I don't know what it's going to be. I'm going to throw a lot at you. So you guys can ask questions, if I confuse you or anything like that. So just raise your hand or whatever, speak out. So objectively, what we'd like to cover today is what happens when you have this traumatic trauma to your brain. And it can also relate to stress. We're going to focus on traumatic brain injuries this morning, but stressful events, poor lifestyle, diet, lack of sleep, things like that. Toxic exposure also. But what happens physically in the body when that takes place? And then how can we find out, what kind of testing can we do to see, we know what happens, so how do we find it? So that we know how to treat it, and then we'll give you some treatment options. And then I'll give you some tidbits on things you can start doing when you leave here today, okay, that are going to help you without even ever talking to me again or whatever. And then we'll give you some options to talk to me again, if you'd like to do that also, okay? So yeah, the gut-brain connection is very important. This is Courtney Colin and Billy Brain, okay, so they're going to be with us today, taking us through this little bit of a journey. So healthy gut, healthy mind. So you guys have probably heard that we have two brains, right? We have this brain, and then we have this brain. And some of the new studies on the microbiome, which is a collective, a collection of all the organisms that are in our body, okay? What's interesting about that is that there's 100 trillion different foreign organisms in our body, and 10 million different species of those organisms. And what's really interesting is we only have, what, 9 trillion or 10 trillion human cells in our body. So that means we have 10 times more foreign cells in our body than we do human cells, which is, if you think about that, that's pretty remarkable. And what that tells me is that our environment is very important to what's going on inside our gut. So when you were a kid, you probably played in the dirt, like I did, right? Out my Tonka trucks and find some dirt or mud puddles and play in them. That was actually a very healthy thing for me to do. So I encourage, one of the things I'm going to do is encourage you to get outside, get into nature. I call it tree hugging, go out and hug a tree or walk through the forest. In Japan, they call it forest bathing. You can actually go out and walk through the forest and things like that. But that's very important to your health, and particularly your gut microbiome, to be in contact, to be breathing that in. I love to garden. So when I'm digging in the dirt, I'm just making sure I'm breathing in more of the dust and the microbiome from the dirt, because that's what's inside our body. Okay, foreign. It's developed over millions of years, in our body. So very, very important piece. The other thing that's very interesting is that there are 9 million genes within that foreign microbiome in our body. 9 billion, trillion, 9 million genes. We only have 23,000 human genes. So we're only 1% human when it comes to our genes. So it's an amazing relationship between our environment and our bodies. So embrace that, use that to your advantage, because it's very, very important. Does anyone here like to garden? Like vegetable gardens? Awesome, or flower beds, whatever, it really doesn't matter. Or just getting outside, hiking, sitting next to a stream, whatever it is, stick your foot in the stream. Does anyone know what grounding is, or earthing? Okay, it's another practice that you can do. Going out in your bare feet onto a grassy surface. It can't be a macadam or sidewalk, dirt, sand, whatever. And the magnetic fields of the earth, that frequency is very similar to the frequency of our body. It's about 18 hertz. So when you stand on that, even better if the sun's out and you're getting the sun rays, right, to help with your circadian rhythm, you balance your energy in your body. So that's another way to use the planet or your environment to help balance and calm yourself and just get back in touch with your environment. So those are little things that I do often, and it really helps me. But just remember that we're less human than we think when it comes to genes and microbiome and all those wonderful things. So let's talk about what happens from the gut to the brain, excuse me, and from brain to gut. So Meghan and Alicia touched on a couple of these things, but the first thing we have from the gut to the brain, we have these nucleotides. Leptin, you talked about feeling, how do you know if you're full? Well, there's a hormone in our body that tells you that you're full, leptin. And the thing about hormones is hormones need to attach to receptor sites in cells. So it's like a coupling dot, right? So you have this leptin molecule coming in, and you have a stomach cell, let's say, and they're going to couple together and signal that, hey, I'm full. But if you have inflammation in your gut or inflammation in the brain, it can couple into that dock, and then that hormone doesn't work very well. Or if you consistently don't listen to your body, like Meghan was saying, right, and you just overeat, then leptin becomes less aware of the situation. It kind of gets pushed to the side, and then you don't feel that you're full. So you're not hearing your body. So that's one of the signals the gut will send to the brain. Hey, we're full, shut it off, tell them to stop eating, we've had enough. And usually that's based on nutrition, not the amount of food you're eating. If I goes, yeah, got enough vitamin C, got enough calcium, we're good to go. You can stop eating that. What was it? Domino's? Yeah. I won't pick on you. Serotonin, as Alicia was saying, that feel-good hormone, but we also have dopamine. So, 80 to 90% of your serotonin is made in your gut, 50% of your dopamine is made in your gut, 50% of norepinephrine, as she mentioned, which is adrenaline. A lot of people call it that, also made in the gut. So all these hormones are made in the gut and then sent to the brain. And what you'll figure out, for every one signal that the brain sends to the gut sends 4 signals back to the brain. So we actually get much more signaling from our gut to our brain than we do our brain to our gut. Which, when I found that out, I thought that was very interesting, because we were always told the brain runs everything, but they actually work together, that communication. The vagus nerve, they talked about that activation. I love that therapy. Immune signaling, so Sig-A, you have in our gut what we call immunoglobulins. I don't know if you guys ever heard of immunoglobulins, but you have IgM, IgG, and IgA. IgM you get from breast milk, and you get mom's immune system when you're breastfed. But IgA is our signaling system in our gut for the immune system. So that's something we can actually measure, and I'll show you in a little bit on a test that how much SIG A is happening. Is your body responding to foreign invaders that don't belong there? So to infections. So any brain trauma can affect that signaling, and therefore you're not getting that good communication in the immune system. We're going to talk a lot about this in a moment, the barrier integrity. So something called zonulin, again, is another enzyme that we can measure in a simple stool test, and it will allow us to know how much leaky gut that you have, the permeability of our gut lining, so we can simply measure that. If you're a good shot, you can poop into a little tray, we can measure that for you. We have short-chain fatty acids. So short-chain fatty acids, well, butyrate is the most potent one and the one that helps our gut to heal the most. But that comes from our diet. So as you eat fiber-rich foods or polyphenols, so blueberries, cranberries, things like that, our body actually can't digest those foods. Fiber we cannot break down and digest, but our gut bacteria can live off of those. Okay, and so these gut bacteria come in, they start eating the polyphenols. So the blueberry that you ate, it makes butyrate and other short-chain fatty acids, and they help heal the gut. So there's even benefit to fiber, like, a lot of people say, well, you can't digest fiber, what good is it? Well, it's not meant for you. It's meant for the 100 trillion cells in your body to make chemicals for your body, which if you think about it is just an amazing relationship that we have, again, with our environment and the foods that we have, because those foods, the colors of the foods, so blueberries being that blue color, it's one of my favorite foods, so I'll talk about that a lot. But the color of the blueberry is very specific to protecting the blueberry itself from invaders. So the chemicals in the skin of the blueberry that protect the plant feed our bodies. So it's a remarkable, synergy that we have with food, and that's why food is so important. So those are some of the signals the gut will send back to the brain. And then we have the signals from the brain to the gut. And we have that fight or flight that we just spoke about, and cortisol. And what's very interesting about cortisol is, Alicia, I think you said it, or Alicia, excuse me, if you have long-term stress, we eventually get a decrease in cortisol. Everybody talks about cortisol being high, and that's typically what happens when you have an acute trauma or an acute stress. Cortisol is going to spike. The old adage, you're in the woods and the bear comes, you want to run away from the bear. That's cortisol and adrenaline. That gets your heart pumping and your muscles going, and then you run away to save yourself. But as soon as that event is over, that should immediately drop down, the amount of cortisol your body's making. But when you have a trauma or you have a chronic stress, cortisol doesn't drop down. Okay, now how many of you have gone to the doctor and got a cortisol shot? Cortisone shot, right? Why did they give you that shot?
Knee pain.
Knee pain, right? To decrease inflammation, because it breaks down tissue. Cortisol is a steroid. Well, if you have prolonged stress and high cortisol levels, guess what it's going to start to do? It's going to start to break down tissue in your body. The first place it'll do that is your gut lining. So prolonged stress can lead to leaky gut syndrome or permeability of the gut, which is not a good thing. So just stress alone, forget a trauma for a moment, but just stress alone in a chronic situation for chronic stress can create leaky gut syndrome. So even more important to have those stress management techniques, grounding or whatever, your prayer, meditation, whatever you're going to do, vagus nerve activation, to calm that system down. And a lot of times when people come to my office, with no matter what's going on, we work on the HPA axis and the gut. Those are the first two things we work on. Calm the system down, decrease inflammation. Let's get back to some type of homeostasis so we can balance that out. So that is the fight or flight mechanism. The secretion of mucus also stimulated by the vagus nerve. Okay, so we'll see in a couple slides that mucus layer, that's basically that microbiome. All those cells that I talked to you about, those 100 trillion cells, create that mucus layer. And it's a communication layer. It's not like, just an immune response. That's how our body communicates within these mucosal layers. And the thing about the digestive system is that it's kind of like a tube from here to your anus, right? And what's interesting is the pH of that tube will change 7 times. It's different in the mouth than it is in the stomach, than it is in the intestines, instantly. Like the body can just do this instantly. And that's all run by the brain and these feedback systems from the gut. So just a remarkable system. And then we have neuromuscular control, peristalsis, which is how your intestines move. You can feel that, you can hear that, your stomach's grumbling and things like that. That's the movement of food through the system, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So those are some of the signals from brain to gut. Okay. So just a little study that I found here at International Brain Injury Association, and you guys probably know a lot of this already, but 1 million Americans are treated and released from the hospital emergency departments on a yearly basis with a traumatic brain injury. 230,000 of those people are hospitalized and survive, which is a good thing. 8,000 people are estimated to be discharged from the hospital with some type of traumatic brain injury disability, and we'll elaborate on that in a moment. And unfortunately, 50,000 people die every year from those traumatic injuries. So this is a study I found, Katzenberg et al. It's in PubMed if you want to look it up and get more details on it. But basically they studied what traumatic brain injury complex has and its effects on people. So basically they're saying that in these traumatic brain injuries, they instigate non-neurological injuries also. We know about the neurological deficits that take place, but what about the non-neurological deficits? And particularly into the intestinal tract. What's interesting about that is your genetics can play a role in that. So we do genetics testing in our office. It's one of the first tests we started doing this year now on our new patients, because you may have a predisposition to an injury or the effects of an injury on your body. So one person has a brain injury and they have a certain set of symptoms that take place, but another person has a very similar injury to the same part of the brain and they have a totally different experience with that injury, right, based on genetics. So if we have a patient come into our office and they have some type of ailment, we can do a genetic test and know, hey, there is a predisposition here. Not only do we need to correct the problem, but we need to sustain, whatever type of therapy we give them for a longer period of time because they have this genetic predisposition. And we can't change their genes, but we can change how the environment is impacting those genes. So genetic testing plays an important role in our treatment programs now. And it's cheap now. It used to be really expensive. Now you get a home test, you prick your finger, you put blood on paper, you send it out. In a couple of weeks you got your genetics in there and all your predispositions. So we can do genetic testing for 12 different parameters of health in the body, like inflammation. There's markers for brain, for like dementia and Alzheimer's and things like that, so we could see those. There's also for things called glutathione and methylation. So very simple to do these genetic tests and have some idea of what your genes are doing, what they may not be able to adapt to, and then what would be our course of treatment to treat that down the road in associating with your disease or with your trauma. And then, of course, they found in this study, and that's why I'm here today, is that it increases the permeability of the gut lining, and again, it can happen hours afterwards or months later. So as you recover from your injury, down the road you may start to develop these, digestive symptoms or any type of symptom that's not neurological, and that still can be related to your traumatic brain injury. So there's 2.5 to 6.5 million people that are living with traumatic brain injury caused disabilities. Not only do they affect the intestinal tract, but they can also affect the cardiovascular system, your respiratory system, and of course the GI systems, as we said. So the main thing I want you to take away from this is the number one impact from a traumatic brain injury on our gut is the leaky gut syndrome that develops from that. And there's many other reasons that you can have leaky gut and permeability there, and we'll touch on those also. So we have a healthy brain over there. It's hard for me to say because it's black. So we have a healthy brain here, and when we have a healthy brain, we're getting great signals from the HPA axis. That is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. The hypothalamus, pituitary are two glands in your brain, and then your adrenals are two little glands above the kidneys, and they run your hormonal show and your stress response, your circadian rhythm, your hunger, your blood sugar, your insulin levels are all run by this system and governed by this system. So in normal circumstances, we have great feedback loops from the brain, different parts of the brain, to the adrenals, to the pituitary, to the hypothalamus, to set the stage for all the chemical reactions that have to happen in our body. And then, of course, we get the signals back from a healthy microbiome or microbiota in the gut back to the brain to say, hey, make these short-chain fatty acids or make these enzymes, turn on leptin so I know that I'm full, and all these wonderful things that take place. However, when we have trauma to the brain, then we get basically an inflammatory response, and it gets a little complicated. But we have things like inflammation, apoptosis, which is the body's ability. Can be a good thing and a bad thing. That's where the body will come in and actually destroy bad cells. So you got cancer cells in there, and that's what fasting will do a lot of times. And I know you talked about fasting a little bit. People will fast to create a situation where the body will go in and eat up different cells. Okay, so that's one of the processes there. But when we have a traumatic brain injury, that can start to get out of hand and be, exacerbated. And then we have necrosis. Necrosis is when you're actually breaking down tissue. So that's back to that cortisol response. And then we start to go in and destroy tissue, which we don't want to do. And that creates a lot of oxidative stress on the body. Has anyone ever heard that term, oxidative stress? So what does that come from? Free radicals, right? So environmental stress or dietary stress and things like that. And then we have antioxidants that we can take to ward off the harmful parts of the oxidative stress. But when you have an injury, we get a lot of these damaging cells that come into the body. And what that does is that sets off that HPA axis also to just start firing. And that cortisol level goes up, and it's pretty much downhill from there if it's not taken care of. And then the gut's response to that are just these inflammatory responses from our immune system, also from other oxidative stress synthesis programs that take place. Again, kind of complicated. But one of the interesting things is the transfer of some of this bacteria from our gut to our brain. So when we have leaky gut, I'll show you in a moment, we have this leakage of this bacteria. So the good guys, that's not really a problem. But what about the bad guys that are in there? We don't want them going to the brain. And a lot of people run into problems when they'll do detox programs and they have leaky gut. So they're going to do a liver detox. They don't know they have leaky gut. And what happens when they dump, so when we get rid of toxins, we pull it out of the tissue, fat tissue, brain tissue, things like that, and we dump it into the colon and we poop it out. That's what's supposed to happen. But when we have leaky gut, what happens is those toxins just get redistributed. And unfortunately, they get redistributed to the brain. Okay, so people are actually detoxing their bodies thinking they're doing a good thing, and they're just, shifting where these toxins are. They were fine in the fat cells or in the liver cells. They were kind of protected there from our body, and then we're just going to put them into our bloodstream and get them right to the brain. So we make sure before anyone does any detox that we heal that gut. Okay, so that's very important. But that's kind of the mechanism behind that when that happens. So let's talk about leaky gut. So on the left-hand side here, we have a healthy gut. And what we see here is we have the blood vessel below, and then we have the gut membrane here. And these are the different cells of the gut. And in the middle, we have very, very tight junctions. I mean, these cells are really packed together very closely. And they're only permeable to the good stuff, so to nutrition, immune cells, things like that, hormones, which are produced in the gut also. We didn't talk about that too much. And then we have the villi, which are above those. Those are like little fingers in our intestinal tract. And their job is to absorb nutrients. So it's like if you think about the ocean, you see the kelp kind of floating back and forth in the ocean. But these things are absorbing nutrients and sending them into the cells that will go into the bloodstream. And then on top of that, we have the mucus, which is that microbiome that I talked about, the diversity of that. And then, of course, we have food particles and good bacteria and bad bacteria that are kind of floating around in our intestinal system that don't get through the barrier because it's protected. The mucus layer, the villi, the tight junctions, not a permeable blood system to those toxins, right? But when we have trauma or stress and we get leaky gut is actually the separation of those junctions. In other words, we lose the tight junctions in our gut. And now all the bad guys, good guys can pass through there and easily into our bloodstream. And that's how they get redistributed into other parts of the body, again, particularly our brain. The villi start to suffer. They start to get shortened. They start to get bent. The mucus layer is pretty much wiped out, okay, in more severe cases. So now we don't have that good diversity anymore, the microbiome. And then what starts to happen is the bad guys start to take over. So a lot of times, and I'll show you test results in a minute, we'll see the good guy numbers start to diminish, and the bad guy or the opportunistic parasites, bacteria, viruses, yeast start to take over and take up space in our gut. And then when that happens, what do we start doing? We start fermenting all these guys. And I don't know if you've ever heard of SIBO, small intestine bacterial overgrowth. That's what that stands for. And there's gases that are produced, methane gas, more than we normally produce. And you can actually measure that with a breath test. And we go, oh, you're producing this type of gas. Well, we know what's going on down here. And those are pretty simple tests. When you have leaky gut, if we go back to that last slide, it creates a lot of these inflammatory responses back to the brain. And that's a real problem, because what does the brain do? It reacts in return and starts to send signals to the gut, hey, keep doing this, we need immune support. And it's just a vicious cycle. And the inflammation never stops. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. And then disease issues start to happen, particularly things like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dementia, Alzheimer's, some of the really nasty stuff, cancer, that we don't want to have.
Are you most likely, like, if you have leaky gut, I would imagine since we have a lot of our immune system, you most likely start to just would you have an increased illness, like just even basic?
Sure, like colds.
Health?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Allergies, food sensitivities are huge. Food allergies, while we're on that subject, are something that happens immediately. So you eat peanuts and you break out in a rash, or you can't breathe because you're allergic to peanuts. But food sensitivities could take days to happen. So you eat a food product, you eat some pasta on Sunday, and Thursday you start to have some type of symptom because you're not allergic to it, but you have that sensitivity because it takes time to move through the digestive tract and then get to the brain, so it always have that response right away. So yeah, absolutely you would see increased sickness, colds, and you really shouldn't get sick. You really shouldn't have allergies. No, we all get sick. I had COVID last year. We're all going to get something, but you really shouldn't have frequent colds. You really shouldn't have seasonal allergies. You don't need to have it. So asthma, you really don't need to have that, particularly children. Children do not need to have asthma. There's no reason for that. So we can take care of that pretty good. But a lot has to do with the gut. Unfortunately, children born today are so sick. So we're seeing type 2 diabetes in infants. How does that happen? They're born with it. How does that happen? Well, it happens because of mom and dad. They had a horrible gut perhaps. And they gave birth to a child who didn't get the immune system or inherited a lot of these, microorganisms that they shouldn't have gotten. So it's really heartbreaking to see that happen. But leaky gut is a very, I think people kind of throw that term around a little bit, but it's a very devastating situation. It makes you really sick. And it does lead to those horrible diseases like cancer and diabetes and heart disease and things like that. And there's other reasons for those also. And then dementia, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. All starts with leaky gut because of the inflammatory response of the brain and the body going back and forth. And nothing kind of shuts it down until you address the situation. The good news is, I'm giving you a lot of bad news. We're going to get to the good news, so I apologize for that. Okay, that's a little small, huh? I can blow that up. So this is actually my gut test from 21, I believe. So when we do a stool sample, we can send it off to the lab, and they do a PCR test on it. So they actually count the DNA of the organisms. So this first page here gives you an idea of very acute organisms, like you'll see Giardia on there, right here, which is a waterborne illness. So you drink some water, you're sick for a few days with diarrhea. And these are self-limiting diseases. E. coli is here, C. diff. We have a couple different C. diffs. If you ever had C. diff, yeah, it's horrible. Just absolutely horrible. So these are pathogens that we can see. I just had a young girl who, just to show you the relationship between the gut and the brain. So her mom brought her in maybe about 3 weeks ago. And she was having she was a college student, a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety. Everybody just thought she was a freshman in college. Oh, it's just freshman year and being away from home. But I knew this girl had been seeing her since she was a little kid. And I knew that wasn't, at least I thought it wasn't the case, But the mom was like, yeah, I don't know what's going on. I don't think it's school. I don't think it's that. She just sits in a room. She doesn't get her work done. What the heck's going on? So I, ask her a few questions, ask her about her diet, because I know college diets are terrible, right? So I'm asking her about her diet and things like that. And she's like, yeah, I've had a little indigestion, some constipation, but not bad, not really bad. I'm like, all right, we're going to do a stool sample on her. She came back, she had Giardia, and she had norovirus, 2 different infections. She also had something called H. pylori, which is a bacterial infection of the stomach, which I'll share with you in a moment, the devastating effects that has. Okay? So this girl just didn't stand a chance. And you know, we went in and we treated her, and well, we're still treating her because it's only been a couple of weeks, but she'll get better. But all her symptoms were neurological. Every single one. Depression, you know, not sleeping well, anxiety, you know, feeling doubtful about her situation at school. And this is a bright young girl, devastated by what's going on in her gut and her brain. So that's one page of the test. Notice I didn't have any of those infections. However, I did have H. pylori, right? So H. pylori is at the top there. I know it's hard to see. So H. pylori, has anyone ever heard of H. pylori? Very common, very contagious. Probably, if there's 12 people in this room, 11 of you have it right now, and you don't even know it. So H. pylori is a bacterial infection of the stomach, and it affects the stomach lining. Some of the virulent factors, which I did not have either, are the real bad guys. So they cause like stomach cancer, ulcers, and things like that. But what H. pylori does is it changes the pH of the stomach acid. This is typically brought on by stress and trauma. So it makes you more susceptible to this bacteria. And the number one thing it does is it changes the pH of your stomach acid. Well, our first line of digestion, besides our mouth and our brain, because that counts, that's the first area. We'll talk about the oral part in a moment, is the stomach acid. So when you eat food, food should only sit in there for like 3 or 4 hours. And the stomach acid should be so acidic, it's on the pH scale should be a 1 to a 2. So if I took that stomach acid out of your stomach and I put it on this table, it'd eat through the table, eat through the floor, all the way to China, as I say, right? That's how acidic it should be. So when food goes in there, it breaks it down. The other thing that's important about our stomach acid is our first line of defense. So if I eat food that has parasite on it, I want it to die right here. I don't want it to get here because it stands a really good chance of surviving if it does get there. But if I kill it here, it stands less of a chance. So that our stomach acid is very important. And just something because this is so misunderstood or presented to people, is if you eat something and you get acid reflux, it's not because you have too much stomach acid. It's because the pH of your acid is not acidic enough. So what happens is there's a little sphincter between the stomach and the small intestine that will not open until what they call the chyme, the broken down food, is at a certain pH, about a 3. Then this will open and let that chyme out into the intestines. And immediately, the pH changes to like a 7, so it doesn't need a hole through your intestines. It's a remarkable system. It happens instantaneously. However, if that sphincter doesn't open, the only place for this food to go is, guess where? Up. And when do you get acid reflux? Because the brain's saying, hey, keep making acid because there's food in there. We got to break it down, and there's only one place. That's acid reflux. So what do we do when people have acid reflux? We give them acid. What do they do? What is the medical profession? Yeah, they shut the acid down. Worst thing you can do in the world. Worst thing. So you could do a little test at home and figure out your stomach acid. It's very simple. So H. pylori, I got on a little tangent there, but H. pylori, what it starts to do is affect downstream, because digestion is an above-down process. It starts with the brain, and the oral part of that, and then the stomach, then our intestines, and so forth, right? So it starts to affect things downstream. And in my case, what was happening, these are the good bacteria. These are commensal bacteria. These are the good guys. Now, it's only 9 out of thousands. And then we have the 2 major phylums, the Bacteroides and the Firmicutes. So they make up, those 2 phylums make up 80% of your gut microbiome. But what was starting to happen is I was starting to get a reaction in my good guys, my probiotics. They were starting to work really, really hard because of this infection here. But we don't necessarily want that because you don't want to overgrowth, right? We always want a balance in our gut. So that's how it starts to affect here. And then my Firmicutes phylum was starting to decrease. So I have some bacteria that are overpopulating, other bacteria that are underpopulating, not good at all. But guess what? I didn't have any digestive symptoms. Not one. And that's what's remarkable about the gut. Sometimes people have horrible guts and no digestive symptoms, but they have arthritic symptoms. They can't sleep. Their hormones are a mess. They got joint pain. They're getting sick all the time. So there's other symptoms that you can have other than gut symptoms. So even if your gut's feeling good, doesn't necessarily mean that everything's right. You have a question, sir?
If your pH levels, like looking at baseline food and everything, if at some point in your life that was at like a catastrophic state, like medication and things like that, are you more susceptible to your pH levels going up again or not functioning correctly?
Yeah,
When I was 16, I had to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
And they had to give me drugs because my acid levels were so messed up in my stomach.
Yeah.
So I just didn't know if I'd be more susceptible because that happened.
It's possible because there are certain cells that produce that. So if those cells are damaged, or there's a genetic predisposition for those cells not to work properly, then yeah. But I think for the most part, people can repair that stomach acid. Now, does that mean you don't, like you could actually take the hydrochloric acid all the time, wouldn't hurt you. Do you know what I mean? So some people still need to support it because it's, maybe your pH is at a 3 instead of a 1, and then it doesn't digest as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's some genetics that may play a role in that, as far as the ability to heal and get that back. But most of the GI tract can be changed in a few days.
Yeah, I know. Your diet's a big thing.
Yeah, diet's a big thing. So you can change the pH and all that in a few days pretty quickly.
Are you planning on going over what the simple tests are that we can do at home?
Sure, we can do that, yeah. So all of the tests that I have my patients do are take-home tests. They're kits. You order them online. We use Rupa Health to do that, so we get wholesale pricing. So this test here is called the GI map. The DNA tests are called DNA Health and DNA Diet. So DNA Health gives us 12 major categories, as I was saying, like glutathione and inflammation, and cardiovascular and brain hormonal things. The DNA Diet will actually tell us what diet is best for you. Okay, how much carbohydrates you should have, how much fat does your body need, and also exercise. So it'll tell us what's the best exercise for you. We're going to talk about exercise in a little bit. So these tests are, pretty handy when it comes to lifestyle recommendations. We also do organic acid testing, which is totally another subject here, but it does come into play. And that could be urine and blood. Do a lot of urine testing for metabolites, hormonal testing, sex hormones. You could test leptin, you could test ghrelin, you can test insulin. We test cortisol with saliva testing. Also something called pregnenolone, which is another hormone that we test. And then DHEA, which is a major hormone made by the adrenal glands. I didn't even mention that, but that plays a major role in cortisol function. That's what helps our body make cortisol. So the ratio of cortisol to DHEA is important. So we can measure that with a saliva test. So they're all take-home tests. Unless you need a blood draw, then we send you to a lab. They get the blood draw. Yeah. And then we have different gut tests. Like this is a GI map, which is great for detecting infections. Less good at detecting microbiome. But then we have another one called GI effects that is more heavy on the microbiome and less heavy on the infection side of it. So depending on the history, I may run a different test on a patient when I'm looking for different things. I may do both, and that just depends on affordability and timing and all those other things. So there's so many tests, almost overwhelming, how many different tests there are and different companies that we can use. So like I said, we use Rupa Health, so they're kind of like the middleman, and they have access to all the labs, so it's like one-stop shopping. So I can use all these different labs on the same patient. They order from one place. So it makes it really, really simple.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Then the next section here are the bad guys. So in my case, I had a couple of overgrowth of some bad guys. Strep was in there. There's another family. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that one. I don't know who came up with these names, by the way. They're so difficult to read sometimes. We have autoimmune triggers. So we could see, so if you have a trigger, Prevotella is, where is it here? Prevotella here, which mine was okay, and the black is okay. They can be there. They just can't be too high. But Prevotella is a mark for rheumatoid arthritis. Now, it doesn't mean because that bacteria is high that I have rheumatoid arthritis. There's just a causal relationship saying, hey, a lot of people that have rheumatoid arthritis also have this commensal or this opportunistic bacteria being very high when we do stool test, okay? But they're always there. And then the DL just means they didn't detect any. That's what that means. But we could look at fungus and yeast. So yeast is a huge, as the good guys start to diminish, yeast likes to take over. It just loves that. It's just very opportunistic. So are parasites. And they'll just take up all the space. So a lot of people walk around and they're bloated because they're just filling up with yeast, and their good guys are being, kind of pushed out of the way. So we test for yeast also. And then cytomegalovirus and Epstein-Barr, we saw a lot of that with COVID. A lot of people that had Epstein-Barr in the past re-got it after they had COVID or the vaccine, and we were able to see that on the test. There was another, one of the commensal bacteria is called Akkermansia, was just totally wiped out with COVID. Just totally came in and just wiped it out. So a lot of people that had COVID, we would test their Akkermansia on the last page, and it wouldn't even be there. And that particular probiotic is very important for the gut lining, because it kind of repairs the gut lining. So we saw a lot of COVID people get leaky gut if they didn't have it before because of the microbiome disruption. But again, a simple test, we can see all of that. And then we have parasites that we can test for. I didn't have any parasites. This is really good. Now I'm going to blow this last section up here if I can. Yes, sir.
How do you increase that? How did you say it?
Akkermansia.
Mm-hmm.
So we use Saccharomyces boulardii,
Mm-hmm.
which is a specific probiotic to rebuild that. Also amino acids like glutamine to repair that. Berberine is also good to help with that. So there's a bunch of different microbials that you can use and herbals that we can use for that. Yeah, but the S. boulardii is the biggest one that I use a lot, along with other probiotics. Yeah. So here we have the functional capacity. So now we can go in and say, hey, how's it working functionally? Okay, so the first thing we look at is digestion. We have steatocrit. So steatocrit is a marker for our body's ability to break down fat. So if there's a lot of fat in our stool, it means we're not breaking it down. Well, that's a problem. And then what do we think of? Anybody have an idea what organ helps us break down fat? 2 organs. Liver, gallbladder, ring a bell, right? Bile, those types of things, right? So very important. Elastase is a marker for our digestive enzymes. Mine were low at 320, like them to be about 700. So that infection was playing a role in my body's ability to make digestive enzymes. And by the way, I had no digestive symptoms if I didn't say that already. Then we have GI markers, beta-glucuronidase. That is a marker for detoxification. And for women, that's really important because one of the ways you get rid of excess estrogen is you poop it out. So if this marker is high, it tells us you're not doing that very well. So women will come in and have hot flashes and perimenopausal symptoms. And it's just because they're not getting rid of the excess estrogen that their body's making. So they think they're estrogen dominant, but they're really not. Okay, so we could rule that out. And then we can do markers for hormones to see that also. Occult blood, well, we don't want to ever see any blood in our stool. I had a little bit in there, 20. Secretory IgA, that was the marker I talked about earlier, the immunoglobulins. We can actually measure your immune response. So I had some infections going on, but I wasn't getting a very high immune response. So that's a problem. I'd like that number to be higher since I had an infection. So that told me my immune system somehow was a little suppressed. So then we could put things like in cholesterol, right? Which comes from cow's milk or breast milk from the cow. And that builds up those, all the immunoglobulins like we got when we were breastfed from mom. So we can just put those in, it's pretty simple. This anti-gliadin is a marker for gluten sensitivity. So gluten is one of the most destructive foods to our gut lining. And the main reason for that is because of a chemical called glyphosate. You guys have heard of Roundup? So they spray that on everything. So even organic foods have glyphosate in it because it's in our soil soaked with it, our water, our air is soaked with it. So even organic foods have glyphosate. And glyphosate there are 3 things that cause leaky gut from a standpoint of putting things into your body. One is gluten, and the other are medications, particularly antibiotics, okay, and other medications. But stress, trauma, causes the same thing to happen. Make this very sensitive. But gluten, I have all my patients off gluten. Just don't eat gluten. I don't even care if the sensitivity is not there. I just say avoid it at all costs. It's so bad for our bodies. And the gluten that we have now in our wheat products is so much higher than what it was intended to be, 50 years ago. You could eat the gluten 50 years ago, but you can't eat it now. Now, if you go to Italy, you can eat it because they have less gluten. We have like 7 times more gluten in our wheat products than any other country in the world. It's crazy. It's crazy, and it's just devastating. And particularly a lot of brain symptoms with that. We have inflammation marker, calprotectin, so we can actually see how much inflammation is going on in your gut. And then we have zonulin, and zonulin is a direct marker of leaky gut. So we'll know if you have leaky gut. We can measure it. And that's in just one little test you do at home. In a little vial, you put some of your poop in a vial, and we can see all this information. So it's really simple, it's a remarkable test. And then we can follow up on it down the road. Questions? Yeah?
The, whatever Japanese word you associated with breastfeeding,
Mhm.
you get that, whatever. What if a child isn't breastfed?
Well, that's a problem.
So, like my older son, my wife couldn't produce when
Yeah.
he came into the world, so we had to do pretty much all formula for him.
Yeah, it's even not having a vaginal birth is an issue. Because as the baby goes through the birth canal, the natural mucosa, all the immune support that's, that the mom has is in the vaginal canal, and that goes all over the baby, and then they have decreased immune system, particularly skin issues, a lot of skin issues with that.
My son is terrible. You can't even touch him, like you scratch his
Yeah.
skin lightly.
Yep.
Low.
Number one sign, people come in, particularly children, they got rashes or eczema or whatever, it's the gut, it's their immune system, immunoglobulins in particular. Now again, we can give colostrum, we have powders, we have liquids, we have capsules, which comes from healthy cows, and we only deal with grass-fed, cattle and things like that.
Yeah.
After they give birth to the calf, it's like 4 hours after that, they start producing this colostrum, and that's pulled from them and put in a capsule form, and we can give it to you. So.
I'm sorry for taking this over. We can talk about this later, but what does he not have because he was never breastfed? Like, what does he lose?
So IgM, which is another immunoglobulin, and IgG. So those are in the first hours of breastfeeding. So all the immunity that mom has, those are the signals to the baby. Here, this is everything I've been exposed to my whole life, immune system-wise. I'm going to give that to you. Okay, now so that's an acquired immunity from mom. They also have an innate immunity. So some of this is built in because, God put it there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's not that it's a challenge for them. But there's things you can do, healthy diet, all the normal things to build up that immunity.
Thank you.
Let them play in the dirt. They have a garden, get them out there in the garden with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what's our approach? A pretty simple approach. We call it the 5R program. This is put up by the Institute for Functional Medicine, a lot of research behind this, but these are the steps that we take. So the first thing we're going to do is remove any of the bad guys, right? So we could do that with antimicrobial herbs. You could do it with some medications. I do have some people that have to take antibiotics. Like H. pylori is actually treated very well for antibiotics. 2-week period of time on an antibiotic or 2 months on my herbals. You get to pick and choose, But then we have the side effects of the antibiotic that we have to correct. And so sometimes the length of time of treatment is the same. It's just how do you want to go about doing it. But we want to remove any bad guys that are in there, particularly ones that are overpopulating. And then we want to replace the proper things, like if we wanted to put in immunoglobulins. But a lot of times we're replacing the stomach acid with like betaine HCl. We're also using digestive enzymes and things like that. We may use butyrate, which is the short-chain fatty acid we talked about earlier today. We can put that in a liquid form or capsule form. So we want to replace what has been destroyed or what's missing from birth, and we can replace that. We want to re-inoculate, and that's where your prebiotics and your probiotics and your postbiotics come into play. So we want to balance out those structures based on the tests that we did. Like you were saying, if we have one particular bacteria like Akkermansia that's low, we know what specific probiotic to put in to build up that particular commensal. So we can be very specific with the types of probiotics. And a lot of people overuse probiotics. It's probably the biggest thing that I see because they'll take the same probiotic forever, right? And that's a real big problem because, as we talked about earlier, we have, 100 million different organisms in our gut. And if you're feeding your body the same 3 to 7 organisms for years, you're going to throw the balance off. So a lot of times we'll rotate our probiotics. We'll put someone on a probiotic for a couple months, and then we'll take that out, so we may use a lactobacillus for a few months, and then go to a spore-based probiotic, or go to Akkermansia, or whatever we need to do to kind of change it up. So when we're repairing, we'll do that a lot. And that brings me to the repair part, and that's where we use short-chain fatty acids and things like that to heal the leaky gut that's going on, or a suppressed immune system. We may use colostrum, or maybe some vitamins, some B vitamins also in there. And then we want to rebalance, and that's where lifestyle considerations come into play. We'll talk about those in a moment, but there are things you can do that you can take away here today that you'll be able to start doing right away to help your gut to rebalance itself. But those are the steps we take. Sometimes that takes a couple of weeks, sometimes that takes a year or longer to get someone through all those stages, depending on how severe their gut has been damaged, particularly through any trauma that they have. It can take some time. So now that takes me to how we eat, and Meghan kind of touched on this, and I love what she does, right? And do I do all this? No, I wish I did. I can't say that I do all this every time. But this is, there's a gentleman by the name of Richard Lord. He's probably in his 90s now, but he's kind of the father of functional medicine. Most of the labs that we do right now, he developed. The guy is brilliant. So this is from one of his books, the Handbooks of Human Nutrition Assessments. So before eating,
Hydrated.
what's that?
Hydrated.
That's a great point. Yes, you should hydrate about an hour before you eat. You should not hydrate while you're eating, because if you drink too much water, it kind of dilutes its stomach acid. But if you drink before you eat, like an hour before you eat, it actually stimulates hydrochloric acid production. So just plain water will help with those cells. But we want to practice relaxation, prayer, meditation, just kind of preparing your body to digest. Digesting food takes a lot of energy. That's why it's not good to eat and exercise, because they both take a lot of energy. And your body's like, oh, what do you want me to do? You want me to digest? All right? That's why it's not good to eat too late at night, right before you go to bed, because the body's like, all right, it's time to calm down and stop working so hard, rejuvenate myself and heal myself, and you want me to digest this 16-ounce steak. Thank you very much. That's hard to do, right? It takes a lot of energy. Produce a lot of oxidative stress when you do that. Chewing. How many here don't chew very well? 30 chews everybody type of thing. I don't do that.
How do you tell?
Yeah, I can, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to relax and eat. One of the things I see is people on their devices while they're eating. They're so distracted, or they're watching TV. Eating is meant to be relaxing and taking your time and breathing, all really, really important. So before we just kind of setting yourself up for that. There's enzymes, obviously produced in your saliva that are very important, that set the stage. Every part of digestion has a stage. In our mouth, those enzymes start to break that food down. They start to soften it for the stomach and the passage down to the stomach. Then in the stomach, we're going to get this, like we talked about before, this intense acid that is going to just destroy everything as quickly as possible. And then we're going to get into the small intestines, and what do we do there? Well, we absorb. So we have to, have the food broken down so we can absorb it. And then into the colon, what we're going to eliminate. All the toxins and stuff we don't need are going to be eliminated. So preparing for that, so just the thought process, preparing the mouth to do its job. And then during that food intake, we've prepared the stomach now to do its job. Because when we start chewing, the brain starts going, oh, okay, get ready stomach, here it comes, start making hydrochloric acid, right? But if we're just like shoving food down, the body's trying to catch up with us. And that's a lot of times why we get indigestion and things like that, because we're just eating way too fast. And again, I'm so guilty of that. Get home at night, I'm starving. I do a lot of fasting, so we talked about fasting, and I can answer more questions on that. Someone else on that. So a lot of times the only meal I eat is dinner. And I get home at like 8 o'clock at night, I'm like starving, right? And then I eat too fast and I go to bed. Not a very good combination, so I work on that also. And then this I started doing because I think this really helped me, is after I'm done eating, my wife, she's on clear the table off, let's move on, to the next thing. I'm like, no, we're gonna just sit here for 5 minutes and not move. Because you guys touched on sympathetic, parasympathetic, I know we talked about too much. So sympathetic nervous system, these are two parts of our autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is kind of our fight or flight response, right? It's our energy response. Our parasympathetic is our resting healing mode. So whenever you're seated or lying down, your body should be in its parasympathetic state. Well, there we digest food very, very efficiently. But in our sympathetic state, we don't digest food very efficiently there, right? Because our body's like, okay, brain get going, muscles start going, heart start beating, start breathing, increase blood pressure, do all these things so we can carry on our task for whatever's about to happen. So if you're sitting down eating and you're in parasympathetic, and you immediately get up while the food's still here, it didn't even get here yet, guess what? You go right into sympathetic. Well, the body's like, okay, well, I can't break down that food because I have to make sure my legs can get me over to that point. You know what I mean? So just to sit there for 5 minutes, after eating, and just let your body stay in a parasympathetic state. And we can actually test your sympathetic, parasympathetic in the office. We do heart rate variabilities, and we can see your body moving from one state to the next. Maybe sit down, maybe stand up, and we can actually see if that's happening. And a lot of times it's not happening because of stress. Number one reason why it doesn't happen. So traumatic brain injury can certainly affect the body's ability to go from sympathetic into parasympathetic. So those are just little tidbits on how to eat or what to do while you're eating. Okay, so let's talk about some diets. So these are the typical diets that I'll put people on, and not just for brain injuries, but just for the healing process. Because you guys probably heard about all these different diets and which one is best for me and so forth. Again, we could do DNA testing to know exactly what diet is best for you. And that can change over time. Most people, we start off on an elimination diet. So basically we're getting rid of the inflammatory foods. So like gluten, sugar, for some people dairy. Now not everybody has a problem with these foods, but just a simple thing. A lot of times when patients come into our office, we don't have their lab work for 3 or 4 weeks, down the road. So we got to do something to get their body. So this is based on what we call the IgG reaction, another one of those immunoglobulins we talked about. So when we have high IgG reaction, we get a lot of inflammation in the gut. That's a natural response. There's nothing wrong with that. But what we want to do is we want to calm that reaction down right off the bat to help people heal. We want to try to make it even playing field, to help people to heal. Because a lot of people come to me, they're pretty sick. So we want to just calm that down. So by eliminating some of these foods, caffeine and alcohol and dairy, we calm down that normal reaction the body has and just kind of level things out. And we do that for like 23 days. That's not a very long period of time. And then what we'll do is start reintroducing those foods. And we have them journal. We'll say, okay, well, you took out dairy and then you started eating dairy, 3 weeks later, what changed? How did you feel? And then we can kind of have an idea if that food's a problem without doing any testing. That's one way you can do it on your own. So it's a very simple thing to do. Yes, sir?
For eliminating gluten, are you talking about just wheat?
Anything with gluten. Gluten is,
In everything.
it's in spices, it's in salad dressings, it's in things you wouldn't even feel like, why is gluten in there? Because they use it as a filler. It's cheap. We make a lot of it. So it's all over the place. And the label isn't always, first of all, the front label of any product is advertising. Don't even read it. Don't go buy anything on there. Always read the back of the ingredients, and that's what you want to say. And it should be basically food. And we could do a whole lecture on reading labels, but it should be food, things you understand. We'll talk about seed oils in a little bit, that are a real problem for the gut lining. But yeah, gluten, you think wheat products, and gluten-free is initially healthier. You got to read the ingredients, see. Some of them are. There's some really good products out there, but a lot of them could be just as devastating to your overall health than, the gluten, So, and we can remember, we can measure your gluten sensitivity level. So we have an idea how much you need to avoid gluten. Can you have that occasional pizza? Maybe. But I always tell people, if you have a gluten product, even a healthy individual, it takes about 4 months to clear the effects of the gluten out of your body. 4 months. So people say to me, well, I only have pizza like once a month. I'm like, yeah, well, then you have the effects of gluten your whole life because you're never giving it time to get out, to heal itself. So, gluten, I tell people maybe a year, particularly if they're highly sensitive. No gluten for a year, maybe more, but a year, at least 6 months. And then we have the low FODMAP diet. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of low FODMAP. So these are particular sugars, basically, that are produced. They produce gases, and they can be very devastating to the inflammatory response of our body. So there's some typical ones, like we just talked about gluten and wheat, but also things that are really, really healthy for you, like garlic and onion. So, FODMAP diet's a little bit harder to decide if a person could be on there, and this is just a short list. There's a very long list of low FODMAP foods. But you can Google that online and see what they are. And then we have the mito diet, which stands for mitochondria. And for brain injuries, this is probably the #1 diet that I'll put people on. So everyone know what the mitochondria is? Remember from high school biology?
Right? Isn't it the little the things?
No, they're actually, it looks like a, I don't know.
Oh, the weird shape, like, are they the kidney shaped thing?
Yeah, sort of, yeah. They're the powerhouse of the cell,
Oh,
right?
that's right.
They help our bodies make ATP, our energy, right? So the reason I like that is because when I put people on a mitochondria building diet, we produce this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And the brain-derived neurotrophic factor helps our body repair neurons in the brain. Actually helps us make neurons and helps us repair neurons. So if we have brain trauma, we're going to have damage to the neurons. There's the signaling pathways in the brain. So this diet is very specifically geared towards helping the brain to heal those neurons, which is really, really important. So we use that. So again, I'm just giving you some highlights of these diets. They're pages long about what we can do, but that's probably one of the more popular ones. The other one is a ketogenic diet. Studies show that a higher fat diet, healthy fats, can help the brain to heal because we produce ketones. So the brain can live off of glucose, sugar, good sugars that produce them from our foods. That's its main source of energy. But ketones are a better source of energy for the brain. Has anyone ever been on a ketogenic diet in here? So you always should do it with the physician's help because it can be not good for some people. But it does have very powerful effects on our brain and our neurology because those ketones that are made from our body when we don't have sugar there or less sugar there go right to the brain. The brain loves it. It's like smorgasbord for the brain. Just loves it. Yes?
I just have a question. So do you work with different blood types in order to kind of, do you believe in like the whole blood type versus diet? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I don't get into that a lot.
Okay.
I do think it does definitely have some accountability to it, and I usually ask the patients, the people that have come in, and they said, well, I did a blood typing diet. I'm like, how did it work for you? Well, it worked really good. Well, then we're going to stick with it. That type of thing. But I don't teach that in my clinic. Yeah. And then we have the Mediterranean diet. So the Mediterranean diet, what's interesting about this diet is the type of fats that they're using, the polyunsaturated fats like olive oil and things like that. Really, really important. But the main thing about the Mediterranean diet that I thought was very fascinating, when they did all the, you know what the blue zones are? You guys familiar with the blue zones? So there's 5 or 6, I think, in the world, right? And those are areas where they have the highest population of people that live to be 100 years old, right? And most of them around, there's one in California, there's a town in California. I don't know if it's still that good, but it was. And then in Sicily and Italy and Japan, India, I think, has one, things like that. But the #1 thing all these areas had in common was not their diet. In Italy, some of them smoked, right? Some of them were overweight, but what they all had in common was community. They had people. They sat down every day and ate together, right? They weren't on their cell phones. They weren't, getting fast food. They sat down at the kitchen table every day and ate together as a family. And then they had the spiritual. That was another really strong point in that. So I don't want to neglect those things that we may put off as not that important for healing, like those, like family time and friend time and community and spiritual time. Very, very important to the healing. And it shows how these people lived, And when I say they lived to be 100, they're not sick. They're healthy. And you can Google that, and there's different YouTube videos on these people. Dr. Mark Hyman just went to Sicily and just did a whole thing on it and talked to these people. It was interesting. There's this one gentleman. He was 90-some years old, and he went to visit him. So they were sitting on this bench out front of his house, and the gentleman came out and he just had like a t-shirt on and pants, and the doctor was asking him, what do you do to be healthy every day? He goes, I show you. I don't have a very good Italian accent, but I'm going to show you. So he goes inside, he comes out in a suit, and he goes, we're going to go for a walk. So they walk through these cobblestones of Sicily, and they go to a bar, and he gets a glass of wine, sips his wine, 1 glass, walks home every day. That was his little routine. Dressed up, felt good about himself, went and had a glass of wine, all his friends were there, they were doing the same thing, little community. 90-some years old, walking uphill. So pretty amazing. So some of those things, we always think about food being very important, but those other things are extremely important. Okay, so some good stuff here. So this is just added stuff. Exercise, I can't emphasize the importance of exercise. And there's all different types of exercise and stages, and I won't get into all that. But basically, don't neglect weight training. Really, really important. Okay, and I know particularly women don't like to, lift weights and things like that. But muscle mass equates with longevity and health for all of us, men and women. So it's really important to lift heavy safely. If you don't know what you're doing, get a trainer. Cardio, we talk about phase 2 cardio workouts and phase 3 and 4 and all these different things. Phase 2 cardio, just so you know, is you go for a walk and you're walking with your best friend and you should be able to talk, and you can if you really need to, but you don't really feel like you want to because you're breathing heavy, that type of thing. That's like phase 2 cardiovascular, okay? So what I do if I'm by myself, I sing, and I'm glad I'm by myself if I'm singing, but I try to sing while I'm walking so I know if I can barely sing, I'm at a good pace. So it's just kind of an easy way. The other way is you just draw your blood while you're walking and measure VO2 and all that sort of stuff. HIIT workouts, yoga, Pilates, any of those things are really good. Stress management, we can talk about that. Breathing, really, really important. Simple to do, you can do it anytime. Wim Hof method, I don't know if anyone's familiar with Wim Hof, but kind of a crazy guy on YouTube, just Google him, has all these different kind of methods of how to breathe. But there's a simple one just called box breathing. And this is good before you eat or you exercise. And you basically are just taking your breath in through your nose for a period of time, 4, 5, 6 seconds, holding that breath for 4, 5, 6 seconds, exhaling for 4, 5, 6 seconds, and then breathing in again for 4, 5, 6 seconds. So you just really simple to do. You can do while you're driving, just keep your eyes open. Sleep. We didn't talk about sleep, but we could do a whole lecture on sleep. So the adults need at least 8 hours, kids even more. Although as we get older, we need even more sleep. So for people like me in my 60s, you need to be sleeping a good 8, 9, 10 hours a night. I don't do that, but we should be doing that. I know, right? Well, that's part of the problem, right? Because we don't always have time to do the things we need to do because life is just so busy, so stressful. So I don't have all the answers. How are you going to figure it all out? I'll just tell you what to do. I'm going to leave here and then you got to figure it all out, And then hydration, we talked about that a little bit. So I have a simple rule. Half your body weight in ounces per day of just plain water. You could drink other things, you just don't count it. Now, if you're exercising and sweating a lot or working outside, or you're drinking a lot of caffeinated beverages, then you need to increase that a little bit. That just gives you a target zone to make sure you're hydrated, because none of the stuff we talked about works if you're dehydrated, none of it. Brain doesn't work very well, digestion doesn't work very well, immune system doesn't work very well, your hormones certainly won't work very well. So hydration is very important. All right, ready for more good stuff? All right. So eating, you want to try to eat organic food if you can. Now there's a simple thing, have you ever heard of EWG, environmentalworkinggroup.org? You can Google them, they have an app on your phone, but they come up every year with the Clean 15 Dirty Dozen list. So the Clean 15 are basically foods that you don't have to buy organic because they don't use pesticides, like asparagus. You can't kill asparagus. Nothing kills asparagus, it just grows. So they don't have to spray it, so it's the healthier food, cleaner food. The Dirty Dozen are foods you should always buy organic. Strawberries, blueberries, apples, things like that. And you can Google the list, they have it. They just came out with it. About this time of year they come out with it. So they have their updated list. But so if I go to the grocery store and they don't have organic apples, I'm not buying apples. I don't care how good they look, whatever. I'm not buying apples if they don't have organic. Strawberry, cinnamon, blueberry, I just won't buy them. I'll do without. That's how bad they are for you. I won't even take that chance of buying them. So that's a great list to do. Free range meats, grass-fed, red meat, cattle, free range chickens, things like that. Wild caught fish, never farmed fish because they just use chemicals to make the salmon look pink because they're actually gray in color. Spices are wonderful. Again, organic spices, that's where gluten is shoved in a lot of these things. If you buy organic, you're much better off. Olive oil, avocado, coconut oil, MCT oil. MCT oil is a derivative of coconut oil. It's wonderful for the brain, it's for healing. Just got to start off slow because it can cause diarrhea in some people if you take too much too fast. Green tea, you could read numerous studies on green tea and the wonderful effects of green tea on the body. Never buy it from China, always get it from Japan, always. And then coffee, a lot of controversy with coffee, right? Coffee, good for you or bad for you? How many think coffee is good for you? How many think it's bad for you? Oh, yeah. So caffeine is the problem for some people. In our genetic testing, we actually test that, so we know how sensitive or if you can clear caffeine very well. Okay, so it'll give you some idea. But coffee actually, again, organic always. If you do decaf, it should be Swiss water decaffeinated or water decaffeinated because they use chemicals to decaffeinate coffee. So that kind of defeats the purpose. So water decaffeinated coffee, and you can get that pretty much anywhere. But always organic coffee. And if you can, even find out if they test them for mycotoxins, because a lot of coffee has a lot of mold in it, and you don't want that, obviously. So you can talk to, like we get ours from Homestead Coffee Roasters, right down 611, and they test their batches for mycotoxins. You know, and it's all organic. Well, not all their coffees are organic, but the ones I get are. And they use a Swiss water decaffeinated coffee. So, and there's other companies out there.
What's it called, Tom?
It's called Homestead. Yeah, they have a little general store down 611, but they have a roasting company there too. So supplements. Now these are supplements for the brain. We talked about supplements for the gut a little bit earlier, but omegas, DHA, EPA is very important. A lot of people have on 3,000 grams or 3 grams a day or 3,000 milligrams a day of a combination EPA, DHA. When we do our blood testing, we test omega fatty acids. And we can tell if you need more DHA or more EPA, so we can change that ratio. Magnesium, the #1 depleted mineral in our bodies. Most people are walking around and they do not have enough magnesium in your body. Nothing works without magnesium. Nothing in the body works without magnesium. So all my patients are on magnesium. And there's all different kinds. For the brain, magnesium threonate is the best form of magnesium for the brain because it can cross the blood-brain barrier. Some magnesiums can't do that. And then B complex. B complex, all B vitamins are necessary for function, particularly in our metabolic pathways. So if we're trying to heal somebody or balance hormones or immune system, all those things, we need B vitamins. You should never take B vitamins by themselves. Like you should not just take B2. You should always take a B complex. You can add in an extra specific vitamin if you need to, but always take a B complex. Glutathione, has anyone ever heard of glutathione? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so major antioxidant, our body made by the liver. You cannot survive without glutathione. We measure glutathione in our testing, so we make sure that's high. Free-form amino acids, really, really important for the gut lining. Really, really important for our mitochondria to make energy. For our immune system, I mean, again, it's one of those things you can't survive without amino acids. And it's kind of complicated, but we have 9 essential amino acids, meaning you have to get those from your food. The easiest way to do that is through some type of meat product, fish, red meat, turkey, chicken, whatever. That's where vegetarians struggle a little bit because you can do it being on a vegetarian diet, but you got to be really, you got to know what you're doing. You got to make sure you get these 9 essential amino acids. From those 9 essential, our body will make the other 11, and then you get your full spectrum of amino acids. Phosphatidylserine, we use this a lot of times to decrease levels. It does a great job of doing that, but it's also very good for the brain and the maintenance of the brain. And then your rhodiolas, your ginkgos, and your bacopas, herbal formulas for the brain that we use a lot of times in combination products. Typically, they usually have a little bit of each one of those in there. So I take all of those every day. It's my basic. And you can get a lot of these in multivitamin. It doesn't have to be separate pills, but just very good for just health in general. Really, really important. Things to avoid, well, the obvious things, smoking, alcohol, seed oils. Let's talk about that. You have a question?
Just curcumin, is that anything of any benefit?
Absolutely, left it off the list. Thank you very much. Yeah, curcumin's a great anti-inflammatory. You know, I do a lot of combination products with like berberine, curcumin, lipoic acid, CoQ10, and a nice little formula that works really, really well for all this. Yeah, absolutely. Seed oil. So does everybody know what a seed oil is? So like peanut oil would be a seed oil, right? That type of thing. So what's that?
Grapeseed oil.
Grapeseed oil. Now, there are some healthy seed oils depending on
I
how.
thought that was a healthy one, that's what I.
Well, it depends on how they're manufactured, or if you will, or processed, I should say. So if they are sprouted or fermented, or they're high oleic acid, cold pressed, then they're probably okay. But to ask a person to find those can be a challenge. So I just say you probably just want to avoid seed oils. So canola oil, palm oil, I can't think of all the time, flaxseed oil, yeah, all those things. So olive oil, avocado oil, coconut oil, those are your safer oils to use. And they all have different smoking points as far as heating and cooking.
You said flaxseed oil is not a good one?
Because it goes rancid, you got to be careful with flaxseed. So I always buy the seeds.
Mhm.
If you can find them sprouted, it would be even better. I won't buy the liquids because they go very bad they turn. As soon as you break that seed open, it goes rancid like that, even if you put it in the refrigerator or freezer. So I never buy the oils separately. Now, if you buy the seeds and they're organic and you sprinkle them, then that would be fine. Yeah. Gluten, we talked about, preservatives, so some of the obvious things, chemicals. But a lot of people don't think about their personal care products, the cleaning products, the laundry detergent, the aerosols they're using. All those things are detrimental to our gut, very detrimental to our gut. So again, you can go on ewg.org or use their app, and you can look at products that you're using, personal care products, cleaning products. They'll rate them for you, tell you how toxic they are, what the chemical ingredients are, what each chemical does to the body. Is it carcinogenic? Is it a hormone disruptor? They give you lots of information on there. They don't have every product in their database, but they have a lot of them in their database. They tend to not have the really healthier ones in their database, which is okay, because so if you buy a healthy product, it might not be in there, particularly with smaller companies. And then oral health is really, really important. Brushing, flossing, amalgam removal, so mercury, the old-fashioned fillings that they put in when I was a kid. When you have these fillings in your mouth and you chew, drink, hot, cold, it gives off mercury vapor. That mercury vapor has an affinity for the hypothalamus in your brain, and and it can cross the blood-brain barrier. So that's how we get mercury toxicity from our fillings. So maybe 10 or 11 years ago, I had 12 amalgam fillings in my mouth. I had them all removed. And you need to go to a biological dentist to have it done the right way, and you need to be on a detox plan and all these different things. But if you have amalgams and you particularly have a brain injury, you want to really consider getting those removed in order to totally heal. So we can talk one-on-one about that because it's a little complicated. And then healthy toothpaste. Fluoride is not necessary. Fluoride is a neurotoxin, okay? You do not need fluoride. You can have healthy teeth without fluoride, okay? So if you're using a fluoride toothpaste, I would suggest getting one without fluoride. And I'm not a dentist, so you need to talk to your dentist. Yeah, it's hard, but they're out there. There's more and more out there. Tom's makes one. There's a couple, I forget the brand I even use, but there's a couple of them out there. Even Wegmans has a couple brands that don't have fluoride in them. So highly recommend not using fluoride. Okay, last slide, and then I'll be done, I promise. I'll answer questions. So there's two ways you can, if you want more information, I have a website. So if you can just take a picture of that QR code to take you right to my website. I have a free discovery call. It's a 30-minute appointment. There's no charge. You can do it by phone, by video. You come to the office, talk about what's going on, and give you my ideas. I also have a Facebook group. It's totally free. It's called Creating Vitality. So I'm always putting information on there, things that I don't put out to the public, kind of meant for my members, a little special type thing. I do a live Facebook every week. We'll get on there and just talk about some topic. So you're welcome to join the Facebook group. It'll ask you a series of questions and so forth, but I'll get you approved on there. So that is my talk for today. I'll be glad to answer any questions.
I'd just like to give Tony a plug, and that isn't why I'm here, but I've known Doc, I apologize.
Tony's fine.
I never call you Doctor. But I've known Tony for, gosh, I don't know, 20 or 25 years. My whole family's been going to him.
Yeah.
And I trust him with my life. Getting emotional. He's really helped me out a lot. He's a great guy. He knows his stuff, obviously. Super honest. Not one of these guys that's just trying to push stuff on you all the time. I can't say enough for you.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. How much do I need?
Does anybody have any questions for Tony?
often told to walk right after meals. How does that,
After those 5 minutes, is letting your body just stay in digestion, that's fine, yeah. Yeah. I'd probably give it like 20 or 30 minutes and then walk, then you'd be fine. Yeah.
This is probably a question for my Pete's doctor, but my youngest, my 2-year-old, he doesn't chew. And like, I'll put a mountain of fruit in front of him, and like, everyone doesn't think we'll eat it, he'll just devour it. So how do I get him to chew?
That's a tough one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's tough because it can be muscle-wise and there's like weakness, it can be texture-wise, and kids don't chew because they don't like the texture, so they're just swallowing.
I mean, he'll
And
chew,
then-
but like, he'll take like 4 pieces of mango and put it in his mouth. And
That
I'll
could be a
probably chew, like, 4 times, just, like,
proprioceptive
swallow it,
piece
you know?
too, where he just likes to stuff to get that input so he knows that there's food in his mouth. If he just puts one piece in, he may not realize that it's there. That's a whole side piece, but it could be anything.
Gotcha. Is there anything I need to worry about with him doing that? That's my question for you.
Well, obviously, it's not a good situation. I mean, maybe, and you guys know better than me, but maybe sitting down and eating with him and saying, hey, we're gonna chew, and Dad chews with him. They'll mimic everything you do. You know, the good and the bad. So
But
Dad's
he's
not
an older
chewing.
brother who doesn't eat, so that's a whole other thing.
Whole other thing, yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, I would just work, to spend time with him when you're eating, yeah.
So from what you're saying is it's good to be the last person to finish eating at the table, like everyone's clearing the plates off the table and you're still sitting there eating and like
Absolutely.
waiting for the dessert and it's like,
Absolutely.
will you please finish your meal?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we should take our time eating.
I'm an only child, so I didn't have to
You didn't
fight
have to fight
to,
for
to get to the scraps of the table.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to definitely take your time and eat. I know most of us don't do that, myself included. Yeah, that'd be a good thing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the H. pylori, is
Yeah.
someone in your household, most likely, does everybody have it?
Most likely, yeah. So typically, if I'm treating a patient, I'll tell, I mean, you have to be pretty intimate. You can't cough and pass H. pylori along, or sharing utensils. So you at least got to be kissing, sharing utensils, things like that. But I'll usually have the family tested. So we could just do a stool test just for H. pylori, it's cheaper, or you go to your primary care doctor and let them test you. Speaking of that, there's different ways to test for H. pylori. You could do a breath test, not very reliable. You can do a blood test, again, not very reliable. The stool sample is the most reliable way to find H. pylori. Yeah. Yes, Megan?
You mentioned the DNA diet test. Do you feel like that would be a beneficial test, like for concussion patients in general, just to give like a good overarching kind of idea of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle between the DNA health test because the glutathione levels, the neurotransmitter levels that are, or the genes, I should say, that are measured on there are important too.
Mm-hmm.
I would like people to do both. It's not always affordable. But I think either one would benefit them. But yeah, and again, depends on what their goals are. If they're like trying to lose weight or they're trying to exercise and it's not working, and that type of thing. Also, then the diet one might be a better one. But if they're looking for general health and wellness, then the health one would be a better one, yeah.
Would you do the insurance?
Unfortunately, I do not. I mean, insurance, they'll give you pills, they'll do surgery. So functional medicine is about function, right? Allopathic is about suppressing symptoms. Now, sometimes we need that. So I'm not saying that's always bad. Sometimes that you need that to survive. But creating function in the body, when we do all these tests, we're looking at function. And insurance companies just don't want us to do that.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Now, I'm a chiropractor by license, so my license is a little bit handicapped in this arena. If you go to a medical doctor, then perhaps, because they can give a diagnosis. I can't say, you have H. pylori and I'm going to treat you for it. Legally, I can't do that. But an MD can treat whatever they want. So if you find a functional medicine doctor that's an MD or a DO or a nurse practitioner, then perhaps, but again, not most of it will not be covered. Yeah, look, good to go see Dr. Hyman. He has his, everyone know who Mark Hyman is? He's probably the most famous functional medicine. He just wrote a book, Young Forever, or whatever it's called. It's $7,000 just to walk through his door. Just to walk through the door, $7,000 out of pocket. So even they are not accepting insurance, or they won't pay. So it's tough, unfortunately. Maybe that'll change someday.
Well, I just wanted to thank Dr. Tony he promised us a pearl or two that we would learn, and I know that I, even myself have. I'm sure Megan has that can be applicable to our own personal lives, whether we have traumatic brain injuries or not. So hopefully you guys found this to be helpful and beneficial. So I think we're gonna try and make this like a YouTube video, so if you miss something, you can always rewind it, and then you can kind of listen again. So, you know, of course, we have his information here in the clinic, and so he left and brought more business cards, so if you guys would like to reach out to him, and I know you guys took his QR codes and that kind of stuff, so I just want to say thank you. I think it was very beneficial for all of our patients, and thanks for coming.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Nice seeing you all.